Okay, that was all of chapter 3. Chapter 3 was really, really long too. Chapter 4, this was our tissue chapter. This was the lab practical from health, right? Identify the 4 major types of tissues and their associated function. So we have gone from chemical level of organization to cell level of organization, and now we're at tissue level of organization, okay? You should remember the 4 major types. There's one type that covers and lines everything. What is that? What is the groups of tissues that cover and line everything? Epithelium. Okay. What is the group of tissues that hold and bind everything together?
Connective.
Connective. What is the group of tissues that have the ability to contract? Muscle tissue. What is the tissue that has the ability to generate electrical signals and send them where they need to go?
Nervous.
Nervous. Okay. So we're looking at 4 major groups of tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Okay? Let's start with epithelial. Now, epithelial tissue is a group of tissues that has very little, if any, extracellular material. What did we call that extracellular material? What was the word we used for that? Matrix? Did somebody say it? Matrix. So epithelial tissue really doesn't have any matrix. These cells are in contact with each other. They're touching each other, okay? And we classify them based on 2 criteria. Do you remember what the criteria were for epithelium?
The layer and shape.
The shape and the layers. Okay, what were the shapes that we could identify? Squamous, cuboidal, columnar, columnar. Remember columnar. Okay? Now, we also characterize them as having a certain number of layers. What would be one layer? One layer is simple. Multiple layers is stratified. Did we have a tissue that looked layered but wasn't?
Pseudostratified.
Pseudostratified. Was it typically columnar? Typically columnar. Okay, we also had a transitional epithelium. It was stratified, but what happened to those cells? Remember what transitional was? Bladder, ureters, urethra. What do those cells have to do to adjust for volumes?
Increase.
They have to kind of stretch and flatten, don't they? So they had to transition from a thick wall to a thin wall. So they kind of stretched, didn't they? I think they're primarily cuboidal shaped. I think they were primarily cuboidal. Okay, so let's see. We are at epithelial. Everybody knows how we label them, as having a shape with a certain number of layers. Do they have an apical surface, a basement surface, and a lateral surface? Yes, they're in touch with each other. Do we often have cilia? Yes. Okay. All right. Now, you should remember that glands are derived from epithelium. And we can have 2 types of glands. We can have exocrine glands or we can have endocrine glands. How are they different? Exocrine has a duct. Okay, exocrine has a duct that allows for the secretion to be released at a pore, right? So think about sweat glands. What about endocrine glands? They have a secretion too, don't they? But they just release it to the extracellular material. They secrete it by exocytosis and it gets in the bloodstream. So it gets delivered by the bloodstream, okay? So, all right, let's see, that was connective tissue. Connective tissues are a group of tissues that all have an extracellular material or a matrix. And if you'll remember, we call these cells fibroblasts, didn't we? Fibroblasts. Fibroblasts produce the matrix, And then they're covered up in it, right? And then they become what? Fibrocytes. Okay. Now, we had several different groups of connective tissues. One group of connective tissues were called loose connective tissues. So there was a lot of extracellular material between the cells. What would you identify as a loose connective tissue? Areolar. Remember areolar? It's more like a little membrane with fibers in it. Okay. Then we had dense connective tissue, which means you had a whole lot more of those protein fibers. Do you remember what the protein fibers were that were making up the matrix? Collagen, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Do you remember reticular fibers? So dense connective tissues is primarily a lot of collagen. So what were our dense connective tissues? Do you remember? Dense white fibers, which makes up ligaments and tendons. Ligaments and tendons, okay. Then we had a group of supporting connective tissues that were 3 types of cartilage. What are our 3 types of cartilage? Fibrocartilage.
Elastic.
What did I hear?
Elastic.
Elastic. We had some elastic. That was probably the least abundant. What's the most abundant?
Hyaline.
Hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. Okay? Basically, hyaline cartilage is a lot of collagen. Does it look white? It looks white. And it is supporting. You find it on the ends of bones and in other places. All right, then we had another type of connective tissue that was solid, very, very solid in the bone, okay? Does it have a lot of extracellular material? But it's solid, isn't it? That was called hydroxyapatite, remember that? And then we had a fluid connective tissue, which was the blood. Blood is a connective tissue, but it had a fluid matrix. What do we call the fluid portion of blood? Plasma. What are the formed elements in blood? What are the cells in blood? Red blood cells. What else? White blood cells, all the white blood cells, and then you have cellular fragments called platelets. Okay? All right. What is the function of nervous tissue?
Sensing.
Well, it's a communication system, isn't it? And we can communicate, our body can communicate with all parts of it because of electrical signaling. What is the cell that's primarily involved in nervous tissue? What's the functional cell of nervous tissue? Neurons. What are the supporting cells called? What are the supporting cells of the nervous system called? How about neuroglia? Remember neuroglia? We have 6 different neuroglia. 4 of them are part of the central nervous system, 2 are part of your peripheral nervous system. You need to go back and review that if you don't remember that. How many types of muscle tissue do we have? 3. Can you name them?
Smooth.
Cardiac.
Smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. Do you remember all the characteristics of each of them? You need to go back and look at the characteristics. Shape characteristics, number of nuclei, whether they're striated or not, whether they're voluntary or not, something about their shape. Was there anything else? Okay. And the primary characteristic that's common to all of them is that they have the ability to contract, which means the muscle can shorten and cause pressure. It can cause a change in the shape of the muscle. Okay, chapter 5 starts at 28. This was our first organ system. This was the integumentary system. What does the integumentary system include? Skin,
Hair.
hair, and fingernails. This is the biggest organ system. It completely covers and protects your body, doesn't it? Okay. 29, we had several layers of the epithelium, epithelia that is part of your skin. What is the outermost layer of your skin called?
Epidermis.
Epidermis. What is the second layer of your skin called that's deeper? And what is the tissue underneath the skin called? Hypodermis or subcutaneous? What is the tissue type? What is the tissue type? What kind of tissue is it? What's in the subcutaneous layer? Fat or adipose, okay. So your epidermis is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. The stratified squamous epithelium that make up your epidermis is considered to be keratinized. What does that mean? The cells have keratin, which make them tough, durable, and waterproof, but what does it do to the cells eventually? They die. Don't you have a whole bunch of dead cells on the outside that are constantly being shed? Okay? You remember the 5 layers of the epidermis. What do you have to remember? What's the mnemonic?
Big, strong guys love honey.
Big, strong guys love Connie. You need to know those in order from the bottom to the top. Big, strong guys love Connie. Corneum is on the outside, basilae is the bottom. Okay? You have all 5 layers in thick skin. Where do you have thick skin? Hands and feet. Which layer is not present in thin skin?
Lucidum.
Stratum lucidum, the middle one, okay? Okay, so, keratin is important because it makes for strong, tough, durable cells. Do we have stratified squamous epithelium lining our oral cavity and our digestive tract? Yeah, but it's not keratinized, is it? It's gotta be moist, glandular, all those cells are living. Do we still shed cells? But they're constantly being replaced. What's the importance of melanin? What is melanin?
Color?
It's the pigments that give your hair, your skin, your eyes color, okay? It is a protective molecule. If you're exposed to UV radiation, your melanocytes produce more melanin, and what happens to your skin? It gets darker, okay? It gets darker. It's a protective pigment molecule. Is it also in the iris of our eye? Is it also, like if you have freckles? It helps, it gives your hair the color that it's supposed to be. Okay? You have other areas in your skin that are pigmented, so you're gonna have more melanin in those areas, okay? But we often think of the blood as giving skin a slightly pink color, right? But melanin is the primary pigment that gives your skin color and hair color. Let's see. All right, sweat glands have ducts, don't they? So what kind of gland are they? Exocrine. They're exocrine glands, right? Now, we have 2 different types of sweat glands that are produced in the epithelia. Okay, one is called eccrine sweat glands. Those are just your normal sweat glands that produce a dilute sweat by exocytosis. So these are your general sweat glands, the eccrine sweat glands. What's the other type of sweat gland that becomes active when you reach puberty? Apocrine sweat glands. And they secrete their sweat a little differently. Part of the cell is lost when it releases its secretion, so that sweat has a different composition. It's going to have a lot more lipid, more cellular components that are part of the secretion. So what happens to apocrine sweat? Bacteria start working on it, don't they? And it produces odors. BO. apical sweat glands are associated with body odor. If you can detect it, it's because of the apical sweat glands. Okay, that finished chapter 5. Chapter 6, functions of the bone and the skeletal system. This is our second system. Obviously, bones support the weight of our body. With the muscles, it allows for movement because our bones are hinged together. Do our bones protect certain parts of our body? Yeah, protect our brain, spinal cord, protect our thoracic organs. Do we store material in our bones? Yeah. Do we make blood cells in our bones? Okay, in the spongy bone marrow, or the red marrow, right? So we do produce blood cells in our bones. The bones have many, many important functions. Okay, why is red marrow red?
Red blood cells.
It has red blood cells in it. It's tissue that's producing red blood cells. What is the pigment in red blood cells that gives it the red color?
Doesn't it start with a C?
What is the pigment in red blood cells that makes it appear to be red? If oxygen is binding with that pigment, it makes it very bright red. Hemoglobin. Hemoglobin. So all the tissue that is in that red marrow is tissue that's producing red blood cells. It's called hematopoietic tissue. Hematopoietic tissue. Okay. Do we have another type of marrow? What is it?
Yellow.
Yellow. And what is it primarily? What kind of tissue is it? It's adipose tissue. Okay, and we generally find it in our long bones, in the medullary cavity. Okay, 34. This is talking about those terms, including the anatomy of the long bone. You should remember what the epiphyses are. You should remember articular cartilage. You should remember epiphyseal plates. You should remember diathesis. You should remember the medullary cavity. You should know the location of compact bone and spongy bone. Where's compact bone? The diathesis is primarily compact bone, but you have compact bone on the surface of all bone. Even on the ends where there's spongy bone, you have compact bone on the outside of it. Do we have some membranes that are associated with the long bone? What's the membrane on the outside of the bone?
Periosteum.
Periosteum. What's the membrane lining the medullary cavity? Endosteum. Endosteum. Do you remember the arterial foramen? Isn't bone heavily vascularized? Yeah, okay. Let's see. Do you remember the types of bone cells that are possible? What are the bone cells that make the matrix?
Osteocytes.
Osteoblast. Which ones maintain it? Okay, it's the same cell, isn't it? It's just quit making bone matrix, so it's basically maintaining it then. What are the bone cells, separate bone cells that break down the matrix? Osteoclast, okay? And we have similar terms for cartilage cells, don't we? Chondroblast, chondrocytes, and chondroblast, okay? All right, we need to be able to compare compact and spongy bone. You know, compact is much, much denser and has many different, well, it had 3 different types of lamella. What are lamella? What are lamella?
The ring.
They're just layers, aren't they? They're layers of bone. And when you talk about compact bone, they were often circular, weren't they? We had rings of bone around the central canal. Those were called concentric lamella, right? But these were round, weren't they? So what are the spaces in between filled with? Interstitial lamella. And then around the entire bone you have circumferential lamella. Okay, and then all of that is covered with periosteum. You remember all that? Where are my osteocytes?
Macula.
Are they between the lamella? What are the little spaces that they occupy called?
Connective.
Lacuna.
Oh, lacuna.
So those osteocytes are living in that bone between the layers. Can they communicate with each other? Yes, they can. Okay. How is spongy bone different? Is it all solid?
No.
Are there a lot of spaces between it? Didn't it look like a loofah? There's lots of spaces. And what's in those spaces? What kind of tissue is in the spongy bone? We've already talked about it. It's a type of marrow. What kind of marrow is in the spongy bone? Red marrow. Red marrow. Yellow marrow is in the cavities, right? Medullary cavities. Okay. All those little bony plates that we saw on spongy bone were called trabeculae. Do you remember that? They were bony plates, and you can see it on the slide. Could you tell the difference between compact and spongy? What did compact look like? Tree trunks. Remember? Tree trunks. Spongy bone, there were lots of spaces in between, and you could see the red blood cells in between those spaces. Okay? Okay, 37. Contrast intramembranous and endochondral ossification. These are two different ways that bone is produced in embryonic development. Okay, early in embryonic development, what's surrounding the brain? It's just membrane, isn't it? It's just membrane. So intramembranous ossification is when ossification centers develop in the membrane, start producing bone, and it produces the bony plates of the skull, right? Okay, when that child is born, are all the bones complete? Do we have spaces in between? What are those spaces called? Fontanelles. We commonly call them soft spots, don't we? But they're technically called fontanelles. What about the rest of the developing skeleton? What's it made of? Cartilage. It's made of hyaline cartilage, isn't it? So that starts being replaced by bone in what's called endochondral ossification. So you start having ossification centers develop in the cartilage, and cartilage is replaced by bone. So, when does bone stop growing or stop being ossified? When you have the epiphyseal line. When does that occur generally? When does it occur for women? For girls? Boys in the 20s. Girls, it's earlier. Okay, remember for girls it's around 14, 15. For guys, it's usually later in their early 20s. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Now, the stages of fracture repair. We talked a lot about fractures, different kinds of fractures. If you break a bone, is it going to bleed? It's heavily vascularized. But does it repair real quickly? Yes, it can. That pool of blood that's formed when it breaks is called a hematoma. And then will that eventually form a clot? Yes. And then will that eventually be replaced by a callus? Callus is temporary tissue. It's going to be a lot of collagen, it's going to be a lot of protein fibers that form the callus. Eventually that callus will be replaced, it will be ossified, and the bone will be remodeled over time. Okay? Does everybody understand what remodeling means? Okay, bone is changing, bone is constantly changing.